My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. My name is Joshua Gibson. I am your host, and we are back from a very brief hiatus. I think I took a few weeks off from posting podcasts, mostly because I didn't have any recorded, but also because of the Arnold, the American Open Series 1. It took up a lot of time and a good few days, and then the travel between and kind of getting back into the swing of things. So we are back with episode 190. And today we're actually joined by someone who, our previous guest, Derek Evely, he was on episode 189. He talked about long-term athlete development. He was also on, episode like 122, 123, where he talked about exercise classifications and then kind of like using the quote-unquote Bondarchuk system for weightlifting. Derek Evely has had nothing but high praises to sing for Mike Young, which is who we have on today. Mike, thanks for joining me and being up for having this conversation.
Well, thanks for having me, Josh, and thanks to Derek for the plug. I do appreciate it. Derek's a very smart guy himself, and I think you're in good standing if you're having him on 3 times. So I appreciate to be in good company.
Oh, sure. And honestly, because of the recommendation, I can't say that I'm familiar with your work. I mean, I've tracked you for a long time. I've heard your name. I've listened to podcasts, and I've had some exposure, but I'm not overly kind of in the weeds with what you've done, where you've been, your achievements, accomplishments, and kind of the work you've put out. So I'd love to start off the podcast by getting a bit of a kind of a primer on your background, how you got into athlete development, what your experience was like in athletics, and kind of what you're hoping to do in this space. So maybe we can kind of start from the beginning and kind of work to, where we're at present day.
Sure. So I, like many coaches, was a former athlete who loved the physical development side of the sport. I first competed in track and field at the high school level, along with basketball, football, cross country, swimming, kind of a little bit of everything, but quickly found myself steering towards the performance-oriented sports. Did a little bit of powerlifting in high school, and then at the collegiate level, did track and field at Division I level for 5 years, and then competed a little bit in the sport of weightlifting as just slightly post-collegiate in what would now be called open, and then went to bobsleigh and skeleton. So had a long background in individual sports as an athlete. Never quite reaching like an elite level. In some cases, just like Division I level. In other cases, I was kind of national class level. But always aspiring for more, like many of the best coaches are. That kind of aspiration led me to a path as early as about 12, 13 years old, really, of trying to figure out what I needed to do to make myself better. So I was really diving into a lot of the sports sciences from a very early age. I thought I wanted to be a doctor, medical doctor, but ended up foregoing that route and becoming a sports scientist in terms of my educational background. But so in college, I majored in ex-phys, or that's what I ended up getting my bachelor's degree in ex-phys after foregoing like a medical track. Master's degree in coaching science, and then a PhD in biomechanics and minor in physiology. Around my around my master's degree, that's where I started to coach a little bit more in earnest. I was a graduate assistant coach at Ohio University, both in the weight room as well as on the track. So I coached I handled all of the weight room work for the entire track and field team, as well as the handled the on the track work for some of the jumping events. And from there, I was able to work under a guy named Ethan Reeve, who was very instrumental in my formative years as a S&C coach. He later became the national president of the Collegiate Strength and Conditioning Coaches Association. A true legend in the field, at least in terms of collegiate strength and conditioning coaches. And worked under him for a year and a half, 2 years, but really had an impact that was much larger than that, both in terms of my coaching philosophy as well as how I coach. And then went from there to work at LSU. I did my doctorate at LSU, but I like to think that I learned more on the track than I did in the classroom. And that's not really a knock against my PhD advisor, who was brilliant, and I had some great advisors there as well. But every day on the track, I was working under a guy named Boo Schexnader. I was his assistant for 4 years. That's probably the first checkpoint where I crossed paths with Derek, is that Boo and Derek and myself really are kind of all under a very related coaching family tree. And while at LSU, we were quite successful in the sport of track and field, won 6 team national championships in 4 years across men and women and indoor and outdoor track. And then from there, I was primarily coaching jumpers and multi-eventers, and that was just like absolutely mind-blowing to me. I was going home or going back to my office every day after having left the track, and writing down what I had learned from Boo, and how much more I needed to dive into things, and how to coach, what to coach, how to see things, that kind of thing. And then from there, I took a full-time job at Army at West Point and coached there for 3 years, jumpers, sprinters, and multi-eventers. At that point in time, I realized that the business that I had started while at LSU was something that I wanted to pursue full time. So I started a business, and it was kind of running as a virtual company, so to speak. Like not virtual in that it didn't exist, but virtual in that we didn't really have a brick and mortar presence. I was basically just doing consulting, coaching, education, maybe a little bit of what might now be called online coaching for some athletes. This is a good 20 plus years ago. And so I took that and I kind of ran with it, did a little search on where I wanted to open a business, and landed on North Carolina. Kind of a long story put short, is a handful of things converged together, and I'd never even really set foot in the state of North Carolina, but a couple of things happened, and I ended up here. I had your more perhaps predictable locations also on the radar. Your Southern California, which is actually where we first incorporated, Dallas, Florida, that kind of thing. And but I ended up through a handful of unusual circumstances landing in the first place we took our site visit, which is the Raleigh-Durham area of North Carolina. And we've just stayed here since and have not regretted it. Since then, we still have this private sector business called Athletic Lab. We work everything from youth athletic development through professionals. I have a professional level track and field team that I have run 2 separate iterations of. When I first started the business for about 6 years, 5-6 years. And then I've got another group now that I have for about 5 years, 6 years or so, and then took a little hiatus from track and field in the middle. But have also ventured into team sports. So I've worked a lot in team sports. That was something that was kind of new to me. Started working in soccer. So in many circles, I'm a soccer guy, even though I'm not necessarily see myself as that. But I've worked with many top flight soccer organizations. A second division team in North Carolina is what kind of kicked it off. They basically just fell into my lap, and we did really well. Dominated our level. caught the attention of enough people that I was offered a couple MLS jobs right off the back of that, sight unseen, and took one of them up in Vancouver, Canada. Was there for 2.5 years, ran the business from afar, and that team was quite successful at the Canadian level. First Canadian team to make a playoffs, won a Canadian Cup championship, that kind of thing, and came back to North Carolina. Started working with some North Carolina teams again, including a women's team, a newly formed women's team that is North Carolina Courage. Actually, take work with them now effectively on a full-time role with them. We are the winningest women's soccer team in North American history. Won a couple championships and international championships and different cups and different things. And I handle everything with them, from the sports science monitoring, GPS, heart rate tracking, wellness monitoring, performance testing, all of that, as well as their S&C, warm-ups, speed development, game day fitness. So it's a little bit of a blend of what I've learned as a all-around performance coach and having a background in sports science. You dabble a little bit of that with a sport like soccer, where it is more of a hybrid sport than, say, a track and field. Track and field, you're effectively a specialist, right? You're a speed guy, or you're an endurance guy, or you're a power guy. And a lot of my background as a coach was as a speed and power. Quite a bit of my background, almost by academic default in terms of physiology, is endurance and energy system background. So this kind of lets me cross a couple different domains and use the unique characteristic there. And then along the years, I've coached our weightlifting team. I think I've spent quite a few years working with the team that we have at Athletic Lab, the Athletic Lab Weightlifting Club. It's since been handed over to a very good assistant, someone who's really taken off with it. That's Jared Knob. And he's just done a great job with it. So now I don't coach our weightlifting team at all, other than here and there with my daughter. And I'm a fan of this sport of weightlifting, as well as other performance-oriented sports. That's still kind of the heart and soul of what I love about S&C, is that we can quantifiably improve on this really tangible thing without the need for strategy or gamesmanship or officiating or what have you. I really like that aspect of what we do. So I still have a passion for, all things performance, whether that's weightlifting or track and field or what have you. But yeah, the business itself, we've been running for 14 years, the whole time. And even more than that, probably going on 20 years. I've always straddled 2+ domains, meaning private sector, collegiate coaching, or pro. So I left out that I also coached at NC State. Also have had a couple of university academic gigs, but I've always, for the past 14 years, I've had the business, and then have had either a pro and or a collegiate job in addition to it.
Wow.
So I much to the chagrin of my wife, I have probably taken on 2, sometimes 3 full-time roles at a time. I do really enjoy it. I've kind of realized that it's I need to pare back a little bit, but it's I do love this side of it, and I enjoy coming to work every day.
This podcast is brought to you by Onyx Weightlifting Co. I've been very selective about finding sponsors for the show, but after much deliberation, in conversation with Chris and Danny, the co-owner and founder, we decided that Onyx is beyond a great fit to support this podcast. Onyx is a brand built on providing the strongest and most comfortable straps, wraps, belts, and apparel to the weightlifting community, with the leather products handcrafted by the same barbell calloused hands that you have. Make sure you pick up something today at onyxstraps.com using the code PHILWL for 10% off of your purchase. That is onyxstraps.com, ONYX straps.com, using the code PHILWL WL for 10% off of your purchase. And thanks as always for supporting the show. Yeah, I mean, there's just so much to explore there, given the depth of your experience as an athlete, as a coach, and as kind of someone integral to kind of someone's performance or people's performance. And I'd like to kind of take a big step back and explore the academic side of things a bit. Just thinking about what your motivation was, or what kind of drove you to pursue a PhD in biomechanics. And I was at a university recently, and one of the I think he was on the strength staff for the football team at Cal, and he was saying, like, you need a master's degree. It doesn't necessarily matter as much what it's in. And I think, looking at kind of the field at large, my understanding is that, like, most people now are going for a graduate degree, getting a master's in sports science, some sort of coaching science or performance science or high performance, and less people take that next step to get a doctorate. So for you, why did that make sense, or what was the driving force behind getting a doctorate degree and kind of taking your education to the next level?
It's a little hard to, I guess, put into words, but I have this, whether it's a personality characteristic or a personality flaw, is that I always like to take things to their highest level. So that's something that's been true in any regard. And I saw the PhD as kind of like a distinguisher. Many people ask me, do you need to have that? And like the advice that was given to you, I would say you probably don't. I will also say that it has opened some doors for me that otherwise might not have been open if I didn't have the PhD. Really just depends on what you want to do. Being completely blunt and honest with you, what I will say is that my intent with the PhD was really twofold. One is to get that terminal degree, that the pinnacle degree, but also what I wanted to do was be able to kill two birds with one stone and get experience at the highest level of sport. And at the time, track and field, LSU was God status. They're still perennially extreme. They're perennially extremely high. They're always a top 5 program in the country in terms of track and field. And really, if you were to make LSU a country, they would probably be one of the top 10 or 15 countries in the world in the sport of track and field. So I looked at it as this opportunity to almost provide me with an opportunity to jump several levels and learn from the absolute best when you otherwise might not be able to do that. So, if I were to say, like, try to learn what LSU is doing, or get that level of immersive education and experience, there's practically no way you could do it. Like, those types of schools don't often have a GA. It's really common to have a GA for strength and conditioning, but for the actual sport, your really big time schools oftentimes don't have a GA position because they are using those staff positions elsewhere, or they don't find use for the money. Like, they don't feel like that position, kind of a grunt type position, is going to serve them very well. So oftentimes you don't see, like, your really top 10 programs in the country have GA positions. So I saw the PhD as an opportunity to have a funded position where I could both learn in the classroom as well as learn experientially on the track. I had a grant for my PhD where it was actually paying me to go to school, paying me reasonably well. So I could then take that money and then be an assistant, for all intents and purposes, a volunteer assistant at LSU. I was treated as if I was on staff. I was given national championship rings. I was given the polos and the full gear kit and everything else like that. I could travel with them on occasion, but I wasn't being paid by the team. But what it allowed me to do was get an education and experience that was, a form of payment that was basically priceless, and networking and everything else. So, the first day I'm out at the track, I'm seeing Olympians, guys are showing up in their Jamaican national team uniform and their, Ghanaian national team uniform. And it's just eye popping to me because these are people who I've read about in track and field news, and they're kind of legendary. And now I'm seeing them and working with them and training them on the track. So when I was looking to apply for PhD programs, all I was doing was I literally cross-referenced the programs that were the top 10 in track and field with those that had sports science schools. So when cross-referencing, there was really only 4 of the 10 remaining, right? So some schools just simply don't have a PhD in sports science. So that eliminated those, say, 6 schools. They had a top 10 program, but they didn't have a sports science program. So you take those remaining 4 schools, I applied to all of them. And really, I applied thinking that I didn't really care for it to be necessarily biomechanics. Some schools I applied for physiology. At LSU, I actually applied for motor learning. And the reason I applied for motor learning, to be quite frank, is because I thought it would be the easiest subject and allow me to spend more time with track and field. It turned out that my test scores coming in were good enough that they could give me a huge grant if I converted to be biomechanics. The money was compelling enough at the time where I said, "Hey, let's do this." So I quickly turned foot and went on to a biomechanics degree, and ended up finishing with the biomechanics degree and adding a physiology background to it, a minor to it. But really, I was looking to double up, basically, not just get this degree, but where could I get the degree, but also have a subsidized exposure to the very highest level. If you would have said, "Hey, the best PhD program for biomechanics is at, I don't know, Eastern Northern Tennessee."
Yeah.
I'm making up some ridiculous school, but they don't have a track and field program, or they don't have a S&C program that I would have wanted. I wouldn't have gone there. It wouldn't even have been on my radar.
Right.
So I was looking to really get the both things, because I was pretty certain I didn't want to be in academics. So even though there's very few people that get a PhD in coaching, I knew most people who get a PhD want to do academics or research. I had a pretty good feeling I didn't want to do that, but I did want to have a terminal degree, and I did want to have this exposure to the absolute highest level of performance enhancement. So, even being at LSU, I was introduced to guys like Tommy Moffitt, the strength coach at LSU, who's kind of another legendary figure. He was kind of big into weightlifting. I met guys like Gail Hatch while I was down there in Baton Rouge. So it really just opened up a lot of doors. I reckon, and even Kyle
Pierce.
Kyle Pierce, yep. He wasn't like a next door neighbor or anything like that, but obviously in Louisiana as well. And so at the time, it was kind of like, in my eyes, a little hub of weightlifting and track and field performance down there. And it was just right time, right place. Even the decision for me to go down there was a perfect scenario. Like, I wasn't sure which school of those 4 that I had mentioned I was going to choose. And I was asked by Ethan Reeve, the guy I was working for down at Ohio University, to take his place at the Ohio State Track and Field Clinic and speak for him. I'm not sure if he okayed this with the organizers, but I basically spoke in place of one of his lectures. And it was a great opportunity for me. Again, I'm the product of many right time at the right place scenarios. And I think my first ever public speaking gig, I was probably in front of 500 people or so.
Wow.
So I speak to these people, and I happened to see that Coach Boo Schuckstader, who's a coach at LSU, was also speaking at this event. I had no idea who he was at the time. And I had applied to LSU thinking I wanted to be a sprint coach because sprints are sexy. And,
Yeah.
that's what everybody thinks they want to do is coach sprints, run sprints, whatever. And so I had applied to be a GA or any kind of position that they would give me at LSU. And I had not heard back. The coach never wrote back to me. So I went into Boo's lecture. I listened to him. And this is after mine. And I said something to the effect of, hey, I applied to LSU. Do you know anything about it? Blah, blah, blah. And he said, no, you probably applied. Probably applied to the sprint coach. He probably is not going to get back to you. But you know what? I listened to your lecture. It was on body weight strength, something that happens to be quite passionate about. Boo is very passionate about. He calls it general strength. And he's like, hey, if you come down to LSU, you can work for me and you'll be more than a water
Wow.
boy, something like this. And I was like, oh, all right, this is like a massive opportunity for me. Personally invited me down there, and so I took it with him. And little did I know that Boo is probably the most respected guy on that staff, and he's the jumps program is the pillar of many of those national championship programs, and he's a hugely influential in the coaching education space. So that was just a massive door that was open to me. Again, right time at the right place at this conference that I wasn't even specifically slated to speak at. This guy invited me down because he happened to sit in on my lecture, probably thinking it was somebody else. And then he invites me down to work with him. I'm there for 4 years, working with him 25 hours a week on the track, just learning and picking up as much as I can. And then that's kind of like one thing led to another. That really, really accelerated my growth as a coach. Also opened up other opportunities to me in terms of like USA track and field and meeting other coaches in different domains. Introduced me to a guy named Dan Paff, who's influential on Derek hugely, on Boo. Coach a couple world record holders in the sport of track and field, and is kind of one of the founders of Altus. If you're familiar with that organization, and that's just been, in terms of my coaching influence, you got Ethan Reeve, who's just a hugely beneficial background in more of an S&C type of guy. Kind of lucked into that. I had no idea he was at Ohio University when I was there. Then Boo Schexnader, who I kind of lucked into him, and he introduces me to Dan Paff. And so the amalgam of those three guys is kind of what has shaped a lot of my coaching philosophy and even how I teach in terms of coaching education, or how I teach to athletes, and then how I handle myself as a coach as well, not just from the technical side of it, but almost the humanity side of it as well, seeing how they do it and how they are perennially producing results, not only results as athletes, but good human beings, so I've really kind of lucked out in terms of the mentors that I have had. In many cases, I didn't really choose them per se. I just kind of was in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, and the really tricky thing about that, the right place, right time, is like, how do you bottle that up, right? Like, how do you give some? I guess it provides its own answer, but it's like, how do you give someone advice, or like, hey, this is like how I was able to do it. This is potentially how you could be able to do it, knowing that I mentioned kind of from the outset, and you kind of commented on it, that most people are kind of getting master's degrees, and it's almost like kind of seems to be more of a requirement, just to differentiate yourself as like the industry grows, and then kind of seeing people then want to take the next step. I would say that my story is very similar in that just a lot of I don't want to say luck, but circumstance like allowed it to end up like that. What sort of advice, kind of looking back and retrospectively thinking about your story, would you give to people who are, getting a master's degree and potentially thinking about like, okay, what's either going to differentiate myself from an academic perspective, or just from like an experiential perspective, knowing that generally the more time you can get under mentors like Boo and like Dan and the better your education. Like the more you can kind of coordinate those things, the better chance you're going to have of being successful. One, by getting your foot in the door, but then being able to kind of like be effective in that space once you're in it.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would, I guess, advise on this is somewhat counter to kind of the shift in our field, and I think it is largely a good shift. So let me first discuss the shift, and that is that our field is increasingly professionalizing. People are no longer having to work for free. They're no longer having to be underpaid. We have some pretty, there's some coaches now in the world, maybe two or three, that are making $1 million a year. There is a recognition that if I get a master's degree, it is part of a merit-based approach to hiring. So I think that's all very good and a very important part of our field. But I think with that has also come an expectation that, hey, I should be paid right off the bat, or I should be, in these great positions right off the bat. And don't get me wrong, it would be nice if that was the case. And I think we can still continue to push for that. And I am a huge advocate of professionalizing the field and getting quality of life up for coaches, et cetera. But I think that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that just because something is perhaps unpaid, unpaid on paper doesn't mean that it's unpaid in reality. Like I don't think I could put a dollar amount on the education and experience that I had while I was at LSU. I was out there for 20 to 25 hours a week for free for the entire academic calendar. So 9 months of the year,
Wow.
four straight years. Was not paid a dime. Just tried to make myself a value in any way that I possibly could. Didn't necessarily, Boo was really clear right off the bat that he didn't need or want me to be a water boy. He wanted me to be an assistant. He kind of scolded me the first day when I went out there and tried to rake the pits while athletes were jumping into it. He said, that's not my role. He just was pretty clear about that. But I think at the same time that there's a tendency now for younger coaches, I think, and I'm seeing this at my private sector facility and different other areas of the field, where younger coaches sometimes want to have an expecting to be fully paid well and have these great positions. And I think, don't get me wrong, I would love to be able to pay these positions. I would love to be able to have all that. I wish I was paid, et cetera. But don't lose sight of the fact that much of what you can be paid on is education and experience. And it's simply not available if you just hop right into a role that is paying you. That's just the nature of our field at this point. And, I think that we kind of need to look at it like this is a field where you need to have hundreds of hours under your belt before you're really going to reach, that's a massive understatement. You need to have thousands of hours under your belt before you're really going to reach any level of mastery.
Right.
You're going to kind of learn, fail, unlearn, learn again many, many times before you ever know what you're really doing in this field. And I think if we kind of jump the gun, we oftentimes lose the ability to go through that learning process, that mentorship process. So it is tricky. We've got to make a living, et cetera. I want everybody to make a living. I wish I made more money. I wish all interns could be paid, et cetera. But I think the reality is right now, we're not say like the law. We're not the law. We're not a law field, right? Where we can pay our interns $80 an hour or something like that. We're not, we're not the medical field where we can pay the internist X amount of money as a flat rate. But there are opportunities here to learn and grow, and we shouldn't lose sight of those. I think that you have to kind of put in the hours in our field to really gain the level of mastery. Sometimes you're going to have to do that at the cost, literally the cost of financial gain.
Mm.
Uh, the I guess capstone of that, I would say, is that in our field, we are a field where individuals are oftentimes laid out to pasture very, very early, very young age, right? So I'm currently an old man in this field. Derek's an even older man in this field, and the the reality is that our earning, in any regards, the reality is that our earning potential is going to peak probably like 30 to 35 to 45 years old in many times
Mm.
in our case, in our field. At least that's the current state of it. And to get to those higher levels of earning potential, you have to go through this process. You almost have to sacrifice the early gains, the quick gains, just like in training, with a longer term vision. And it's during that, say, 20 to 25-year age period where it's easiest to do that. Now, I don't know how old you are and you're going back to school and making this
Mm.
work and clearly kind of devoting yourself to this process, but it's like it's really tough to do once you get a little bit older.
Mm.
And in that 20 to 25 range, when maybe you don't have as many responsibilities and you don't have a family and you can live on your own or live in a small apartment or have the shitty car or whatever it is, uh, that's your opportunity to kind of lay the groundwork for something that occurs later. And if you want to have this success later in the field, I think you really do need to uh, put your time in early. If you can just put in like a year of concentrated personal growth, whether that's a mentorship or studying or whatever, um, early on, I think it will pay itself off in dividends in the subsequent years. And the reality is that in those subsequent years, if you weren't to do that, you may have gotten paid early, but
Mm.
you couldn't go back, and then you just simply wouldn't have the time or the presence to go back and kind of do what you could only do when you're in that 20 to 25 year age period.
Yeah. When do you feel like you were finally able to kind of crack through and I mean, because you list off your resume and it's like extensive. Not only is it extensive, but you've developed things that are able to last and right are able to have a tremendous impact, as well as being a part of like bigger organizations. But talking about Athletic Lab, like creating something yourself that's able to have a tremendous impact and bring people up through it and provide a platform for them to grow. And you mentioned Jared. I'm sure he listens to the podcast, so shout out to Jared. But you know, for you, when did you feel like you were able to kind of differentiate yourself enough to start making that living that was like in alignment with the potential of the field, given what you mentioned as like the investment up front that eventually will turn into something much more?
So probably the first time I really saw it happen was when I went to Vancouver with the MLS club. Um, you know, at that those two MLS offers that I was provided were really like a life preserver in some regards,
Wow.
because the business was about 2 years on. I had not taken on any external investment. I'd basically just self-funded the whole thing, never paid myself for 2 years. My family's a little bit at wit's end, because we're maxing out credit cards, etc.
Wow.
And I had just moved us into a new business location, facility location that was, the monthly rent was like 2x what we had ever brought in a month. So,
Mm.
uh, you know, we're at, we weren't going to die. I can tell you that, but we were definitely, in terms of what would be sustainable, especially from my family's perspective, we were already at that limit. Like, so the Whitecaps came. They offered me a really sizable chunk of money to move over. Uh, it was, I think, when I did the calculations, it basically meant that I could work 1/5 as much as what I had been working at Athletic Lab, and or 1/5 in totality. So 1/5 in totality, but be paid about 5 times as much. So
Wow.
yeah, it was a big jump, and I had actually just taken a job at NC State, so I was coaching at NC State track and field and strength and conditioning at the time. I had only been coaching there for about 3 months, maybe, and that was really helping out in terms of that life preserver, life yeah, the raft to get us out of financial hurt and kind of the overwhelming aspects of managing this business, the startup business. So that was helping, but then the Whitecaps were kind of like, the, I guess, the fully pull you out of the water kind of thing. So
Right.
um, that was probably my first experience with it. And what it did was also open several other doors for me, and it was now kind of, we were successful enough that when I chose to leave there, I was offered some other MLS jobs that I didn't take. Now I've gotten into consulting with very high level soccer teams, and even Australian Football League and rugby league teams across the world. Largely because I think I was able to work in first division American soccer. Not that that's the highest level, but it was a little bit of a proving ground. Like, oh, he's
Mm.
not. He knows what he's doing. We were reasonably successful. I was writing a lot at the time, blogging and that kind of thing, and kind of putting some of the stuff out there that I was doing. A lot of which I think is still probably cutting edge, even 10 years later, 10, 12 years later, in terms of monitoring and wellness tracking and sports science. What we were doing in Vancouver was pretty far out there from what most teams even now are doing, and that kind of put me on the radar, I think, a little bit. It was the first time I was in a place that gave me carte blanche to do what I knew was possible. So I had a big budget and the equipment necessary to do it, and we could kind of do what I wanted to do if I had unlimited budget and I was able to actually fully dedicate myself to something. Um, you know, back before that point in time, and even ever since I left Vancouver, I'm kind of always split in multiple directions. And but during my time in Vancouver, which is a little over 2 years, was I had a really nice budget, and I wasn't being pulled in multiple different directions.
Mm.
So I was able to kind of really hone in on this one thing and take a deep dive on this one job, so to speak. If when I come back to North Carolina or I go somewhere else, it's like I always have someone knocking on my door or sending me texts for this and that. I mean, even in this podcast, I've had a couple people come up to my office door just to get something. I'm not sure what it is, but it's forever that if I'm in town in my business or within earshot, basically.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was the team setting. I think was kind of like that. That was probably my first realization to it, and then shortly after that, I basically took a speaking engagement hiatus from while I was in Vancouver. They had pretty much asked me not to do it while I was there because it would have taken me away too much, and they wanted me to be relatively exclusive. But then once I left, I started to return to the speaking circuit, so to speak. Before I went to Vancouver, I was
Mm.
basically speaking for USA Track and Field almost every weekend, which
Wow.
is actually something I left out about advice to young coaches. So one of the things that I found beneficial, and I alluded to this, and maybe you picked up on this in some of the things that I've said, is that especially when you're young, don't turn down opportunities
Mm.
because you don't know when they're going to pass, and you don't know when they'll come again. And I was early on in my career, I was basically just a whore for any opportunity that might come up.
Mm.
I would go, and somebody'd ask me to speak at USATF. For a USATF coaching event, I would do it. USA weightlifting, I would do it. USA speed skating called me one time and said, "Hey, can you talk at our national convention?" I didn't know anything about speed skating. Yes, I can do it. you know, and then so some might say, hey, you're why would you take on something that you're not ready for? But in my mind, I was thinking I'm going to make myself ready for it, and then try to try to kill it when I do it. And I think for the most part, I was able to do that. And every opportunity I was able to take advantage of, and it would continue to open doors. So I've kind of lived a couple different professional lives, and whether it's writing or speaking or education, I do have the character flaw or tendency, whatever you might call it, to kind of take on more than I can handle sometimes. But that same flaw has also allowed me to have a fast tracked career in many regards. I was coaching at the or teaching at the very highest level of a couple different national governing bodies. I think I have taught a level 3 USA track and field, and wrote curriculums for track and field, and for the two national governing bodies have taught coaching ed for USA triathlon and USA weightlifting. And a lot of it is just if an opportunity presents itself, I'm going to stick my head in there and then try to make the absolute most of it. And I've got a lot of different stories of cases where I've done that. And especially while you're young, just make sure you do that, and make sure you're prepared when those opportunities arise. But yeah, that Whitecaps one was probably the first time I recognized, like, okay, this is here's where I can start to see value in terms of what I've done. I was, up until that point, I was kind of the guy that would probably do it for free, much like many coaches. You love it, it's what you want to do, it's your passion. But that was the first time I saw, like, hey, I can make some good money at it. I think anytime we can kind of cross over the various things that we're good at, that we love to do, that help other people, and that we can make good money at, that's where you find the sweet spot of happiness. There's I don't know if you ever heard the Japanese philosophy or term called ikigai, which is basically that sweet spot of where can I make some money doing what I'm good at that will help other people, that I love. And if you can find that's kind of a little bit where I am right now. And that that's where you're going to find your happiness. I think I mentioned early on, like, I thought maybe I wanted to be a medical doctor.
Mm.
Part of that is because that's what society tells us is successful. I quickly realized, like, hey, that wasn't. I had no idea what ikigai was, but I quickly realized, like, hey, this isn't going to make me happy. I don't want to do this. I want to coach. I like sports science, and I'm glad I made that transition. But yeah, it was around that Vancouver time period where I kind of figured that out. And that's actually, I think Derek and I were probably living in the same basic area around that time, and we didn't really even know each other.
So what I find really interesting, and you kind of mentioned this, is you kind of find that sweet spot where you're able to make a good living, and then to enjoy it, and to be able to provide value to other people. And someone who hasn't found that probably wouldn't be as prolific as you have been, right? I don't think people working in a field they don't want to work in would be as apt or as driven to pursue every opportunity that comes forward, and to do any and everything that could potentially be like a part of that. Um, when you transitioned to Vancouver, and started to make that kind of jump from kind of like, just hanging on to kind of being in the boat, so to speak, you mentioned that you didn't have much experience with team sports. How were you able to kind of take that on, and how did that challenge you, or how were you able to, I guess a better question is, like, step to the challenge of working in a sport that you didn't have much experience with, or with, team sports, which it also sounds like you didn't have much experience with. Like, what gave you the skill set to do that, and do that well enough that then that provided other opportunities down the line?
Sure. So let me just quickly backtrack just a little bit, because this will tie a couple of things we've talked about together. So we start the business in 2009. We're totally bootstrapping it. The only real athletes that I had at the time were basically elite level or emerging elite level track and field athletes. If you know anything about that sport, they don't make any money whatsoever. So they're basically paying for their training with like sweat equity. They're working, they're painting, they're doing stuff like that. One of the jobs that they would do would be like go out and place flyers onto cars. Totally illegal in our area, but they were placing these flyers for our business on cars. One of those flyers landed on uh, the dashboard, the window of the local soccer coach who had just fired his strength and conditioning / performance coach. So he writes me. I don't know who he is. He doesn't know who I am. Hey, we need a strength and conditioning coach for the rest of the season. Can you do it? Being the idiot that I am, yes, I can do it. Of course I can do it. So take that on. At the time, I kid you not, if you would have asked me how many people were on a soccer field at one time, I wouldn't have known. Now, many people wouldn't have. Many people probably don't know if they're not soccer fans, but they don't get their first job working in the sport as a working in professional sport and not knowing anything. I knew there was a goalie. I knew there were some people that ran around. I knew there was one ball, that kind of thing. I'd never really played soccer. I never worked in soccer, etc. So the first year that I worked with these guys, I trained the crap out of them. Like we trained almost like track and field athletes. We trained really hard. We did speed work. We did heavy weights. And I later found out that all of this stuff is pretty foreign in the sport of soccer. Like they basically, especially 14, 15 years ago, there wasn't really any, I guess, precedence for training this way in soccer, at least not at the larger scale. It was a very European driven sport with kind of like thinking that it's very tactically driven. You saw a lot of people who weren't like great athletes succeed, that kind of thing. So I'm training these guys who are second division, think equivalent of like NBA G League or XFL type players, relative to the MLS. I'm training these guys and we're just training the crap out of them. We're doing cleans, we're doing heavy squats, we're sprinting, we're doing like hard interval work. And because I come from a weightlifting, track and field type background, that hard training is the sport, right? So we're training like this. We just start blowing the doors off people. Like we're so physically dominant at our level that this is what caught the attention of other coaches. Now, in retrospect, I realized like that intensity that I did was really good. The stuff that we were the fact that we were squatting and weightlifting and training, sprinting and doing hard interval work, all really good. But I also see that, wow, I had a lot to learn. The trick though was like learning as quickly as I could. So, I remember as soon as I got that role, I started looking up how many players are on the pitch, that kind of thing. Like how long is the game? How big is the field? So diving into it in a much greater extent, becoming a student of the sport. And then really even now it's like I've been working in the sport for about 12 years at the pro level and consulted with some of the biggest teams in the world, sat across the table from Ronaldo at lunch at a club invite at Real Madrid and just some crazy stuff. And it's like, even now I'm like, how I'm able to view the sport and how you train for it with a slightly different perspective because I didn't play the sport. And sometimes I think that's necessary, to kind of not necessarily advance the field, but to look at, take a step back and say what's really necessary for this sport and not be biased by perhaps what has been done in the past or what have you. And I think in the thing that I do love about weightlifting and powerlifting and track and field is that they're so brutally honest. If you want to be, the sport is really, did I get stronger? Did I get faster? Did I jump higher? Technique is certainly involved, of course, to more or less degrees in those sports, but they're brutally honest. There's no wishy-washiness to it. did my endurance get better? Did I throw farther? All of these things are just like so quantifiable. There's no wishy-washiness to it, like a spin class or a Zumba
Right.
class, or like there's no subjectiveness to it. And this is something that is like really important, and a lot of coaches I think lose sight of when working in team sports, is that yes, we need to recognize that you can't quantify everything, but if you're not quantifying anything, you're in trouble. So
Mm,
uh, performance is quantifiable in many regards, and we can take that same kind of mindset of like, hey, if we're coming from a sport like weightlifting, track and field, powerlifting, etc., I think we use that as the best practices model, right? If I want to get faster, where am I going to look? Well, I'm going to look and see what the people who do that for their whole sport, what do they do, right? there's no way around it. They've probably figured out the best way to do it in track and field.
mm,
If I want to figure out how to get really powerful, well, I'm going to look at certain events in track and field. I'm going to look at weightlifting, um, maybe a professional dunker or a volleyball player. If I want to look at how to get really freaking strong, I'm going to look at power
mm,
lifters, right? So there are these sports which really just give us best practices models of
mm,
how to develop these physical capacities. And that's where my coaching origin is in those sports: powerlifting, weightlifting, track and field, and the sports sciences that support them.
mm.
So then you kind of take that understanding and you can start to apply it to these sports like football and basketball and
Right.
soccer, where yeah, you can get away with not having those things. You can kind of hide out, but if you take those same best practices model and then apply it to those sports, you really have a leg up on competitors that are not doing that, because there's nuance to all these team sports. You have to learn, like, I don't know, change of direction and agility, and how factor in the competitive cycle is much more condensed. You're competing every week, sometimes twice a week, three times a week. There's nuance to every sport, but once you understand uh, the basic concepts, I think it allows you to really easily manipulate the the means and methods that you actually use. If you get the concepts right, it's really really easy to work across different domains, I think. And underlying all of that is something that we tell our mentor coaches, our intern coaches at Athletic Lab, which is be rigorously critical
Mm,
of everything, rigorously critical of everything, but incredibly open-minded to anything.
mm,
So if you recognize that you just always have this growth learner mindset, that hey, I don't know shit about soccer, let me quickly learn how many players are on the field and what differentiates each player on the field and what the player profiles are for each player and position, and how does this differ, or what are the constraints of this sport relative to other sports that I'm more familiar with. Now, the very same concepts, much of which in our field are based on the sports science, which I went to school for, now I can take these concepts and start to apply them, whether it's periodization or biomechanics or strength training or power development or speed development, and you can apply it to the specific sport itself. And the means and methods are just infinite, right? You have as many means and methods as you want, and they're much less important than the concepts. If you get the concepts right, the means and methods fall into place. So I had the luxury of having a very good understanding of the concepts through both my academic background and from my experiential background working in these weightlifting and track and field at a very high level, that now it allowed me to kind of apply this in terms of the means and methods that were uh, beneficial for these specific sporting tasks.
yeah. So I have two kind of questions branching off that. I think the first is you talked about we really I think covered kind of your trajectory from A to Z in the sense of like kind of where you started and then where you've been able to go with that and how you've gotten there along the way. what were the biggest, and you talked about like obviously like taking on a lot of opportunity, being able to grow in the face of it, being able to use that to then develop a better understanding of a sport or mini sports, and then to use that again to like get into bed with like bigger organizations or bigger teams, and then use that. What were the biggest hurdles for you, or the things that you struggled with the most or continue to struggle with that uh, you feel like other people may also face and have to deal with?
I think we oftentimes get branded as, say, like associated with a certain sport or a certain methodology, whether it's rightful or not. And I think that's sometimes tough to work your way out of. A lot of times many times see sport coaches say, "Oh, that guy is a," they might see that you were a national class weightlifter or a national class power lifter on your resume that you submitted for a job, or maybe you have CrossFit on there, God forbid, as some kind of bullet point, and they're going to say, "Oh, he's a CrossFit guy." Well, not necessarily. That may just be my sport of choice, so to speak. Or I like to participate in the sport of weightlifting. It doesn't mean I'm going to have everybody bench or powerlifting. It doesn't mean I'm going to have everybody bench, deadlift, squat, max every day or something like that. So a lot of times they want the soccer guy or they want the basketball guy or what have you. And what that is basically choosing potentially, in best case, means and methods over the conceptual framework. And I think one of the things that Boo and Dan really drove home to me is that the best coaches are master generalists.
Mm,
So they're
wow.
really good at many things. Um, and I feel like I would not go so far as to say I'm an expert in any one thing, but I do feel like I could be very comfortable if you put me in a room full of academics and we're talking about you know Krebs cycle and physiology or the muscle physiology, or if you put me in a room with soccer performance coaches or talking about throwing or talking about weightlifting, I could speak the language of any
Mm,
one of those groups and never feel out of place, or never give up the fact that I could talk at a pretty high level in many different areas. And I think that when you can kind of be a master generalist, now you start to learn and have these kind of breakthroughs of thought. Something I said earlier was like, it is it was a benefit, I think, to me uh, to have not come from the sport of soccer initially, and now I work quite a bit in the sport of
mm,
soccer. And
yeah.
part of that benefit was that I see things a little bit differently. Well, we've seen that many cases elsewhere where breakthroughs in a field are made by people who are not necessarily of that field. It's because they see things through a different lens. And, oftentimes the best ideas are often coming from when people or peoples are coming together and having these, you know, idea children, of where there's just these uh, unconstrained, disparate thought processes mixing with each other, right? So instead of having like, oh, I'm the weightlifting guy, or I'm the soccer guy, or I'm the throws guy. I worked with the USA Track and Field Throws as their sports scientist for
Mm,
16 years. Is like, now if you can look at it in these multiple different fields, now you get cross pollination. You
mm,
get idea sex, right? Where these different ideas or thought processes are having sex and producing
yeah.
ideas that have never been conceived before, or
Huh.
making connections that have never been thought of before. And I think that's really beneficial. And the idea of like a master generalist is kind of sums that up nicely. When you can speak these different languages of different thoughts or different fields and then tie them together, you start to have this thought progeny that it basically is oftentimes comes has never been thought of in that way before.
Mm.
You start to make connections that have never been made before, and I think that can be of benefit.
No, I think that's a tremendous point, and I think I always talk about like keeping things interesting and staying engaged by kind of like pushing that outer bounds of what you know and living on that versus like living in the middle where it's kind of general information and kind of like rehashed over and over and over again of like, you know, in weightlifting you want to keep the bar close. It's like, yeah, that's like very important, but I think understanding that is kind of like, you know, everyone should kind of know that, and then branching off to like more deeper biomechanics or more deeper kind of training theory, and then kind of like pushing that bound or those bounds, like that makes it very interesting, and then kind of like integrating other information from other sports or other fields to like further create interest so that you're like captivated and want to explore it, and then also to like introduce new ideas. And you know, a good example is in weightlifting, Max Ada and I were kind of talking a lot about exercise selection and variation, for like skill acquisition, and just exploring that in a way that like hasn't been talked about in weightlifting before, and potentially creating some content on the back end, but that like keeps things lively and fresh and innovative, so that you want to be in it and want to like, you know, explore it, and then hand it down to other people so they can kind of take it and chew on it a bit. I guess my last question, kind of as we wrap up. I mean, this was an incredible podcast listening to you talk about your experience as like as kind of like someone who was in academia, and then someone who's been in strength and conditioning, athletic performance for such a long time, and has been able to do so much on the back end or on the, you know, holding on to just opportunity you've gone out of your way to assume or take on. Is for people who are getting into the field or in it, and then they like think about how maybe they want to expand their repertoire of what they can do as a coach, or what they know as a coach or understand. What are your favorite resources, or what are the resources that have had the biggest impact on you, aside from the mentorships that you've been involved with?
So if I could, I'd probably place mentorships one, two, three. As I
Sure.
already mentioned, you just simply can't learn as much from, say, a book or a video as you can from in person. I think the evidence is well established that
Mm.
we humans as a whole learn best from other sharing of information, human to human. But that said, I think there were some books in particular that were pretty formative to my education and understanding. Some of which are going to be kind of old school. Like I'm still a huge fan of Mel Siff's Super Training. I think
Mm.
it's an unbelievable resource. I think many people kind of discount it because oftentimes because it's maybe difficult reading sometimes. But I think that's an area where you just need to challenge yourself. Sometimes I've read it a couple times over the years, and I think it has stood the test of time. I believe even with some of the new research that's out there, and it is a great book for all coaches. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily start there if you're a really young coach, but it is a very good book. I like the Science and Practice of Strength and Conditioning
Mm.
by Zatsiorsky and Half, I believe, is the newest version of it. A great book. And then if you're looking to kind of bridge the gap between a couple different domains, so those are kind of like pure S&C books per se. The Actually one more S&C book that I think is worth reading because it is very thought provoking is the Strength Training Manual by my friend Mladen Jovanovic. Uh, he's a guy that kind of busts through some of the old paradigms of S&C, and even when you don't agree with much of what he said, I think it is, like you said, a very good read in terms of being thought provoking. And for all those young coaches that kind of think in terms of pure sets and reps, he does a great job of really kind of elucidating just how flexible our field really should
Mm.
be. I'm a big fan of, or one of the things I tell a lot of our young coaches is that you got to know the rules first. So read your Tudor Bampa, read your basic physiology, all that stuff. But then once you've learned the rules, you got to learn how to break them as well,
Mm.
or when to break them. And that's a good book for that. And then the book that I was going to mention that is a little bit more general broad is the High Performance Training for Sports. That is a compilation book. It has chapters by many of the top contributors in the field, research and coaching, some of which are research and coaches, and has some great resources in there. I like there's a handful of things, right? I think the Altus Network does a nice job. I've got associated with Long Term Athletic Development Network, LTAD Network, probably the best source of like long term athletic development online. Um, find people. What I would suggest is find people who have produced at the highest level of sports repeatedly, and then see what they're doing. Sometimes they don't have books, sometimes they don't have webinars, but I think if you use that criterion, that threshold, you're going to rule out a lot of your YouTube jockeys and your Instagram heroes, people who are putting up flash and what have you, things that are sexy but not necessarily productive. Those
Mm,
things are good for being eye opening, but don't lose sight of the fact that a lot of our uh, true leaders in the field are doing things that are oftentimes boring looking, at least at first glance, and look to what they have done to produce the best results over extended periods of time, whether it's video resources or books or what have you. And I think if once you put it through that criterion, it's going to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak.
yeah, just to kind of comment on one of the books you mentioned, the strength training manual. It's actually sitting to my right. It hasn't been cracked open yet. I see it as like a bottle of aged whiskey, or a bottle of fine wine. So I'm gonna wait to crack into that. I'm currently working on a few that were recommended to me by Chris Tabor, which is the system. So it's like a kind of like a strength and conditioning book written from the perspective of like the Soviet weightlifting system, and kind of like utilizing some of those things to inform how you would prescribe training. Working on that currently, and then I'll dig into the strength training manual. But yeah, I mean, in that question, kind of what you said at the end about thinking about what's flashy and what's new versus what's worked. An interesting question that you sometimes have to pose that can be hard to know is what's working because of, or what's working in spite of, and being able to differentiate, like, this is the thing creating the adaptation or creating the change in performance versus this is a thing that exists in the face of. So if we think about like evolutionary biology, it's like what's adaptive and what's just kind of like been along for the ride and hasn't been selected against. And it can be challenging to figure out. And I think having multiple iterations of a program, giving them to multiple people, and then seeing like what's stuck or what sticks and what doesn't, or like when you start to make subtle adjustments or changes, like what tends to like reduce the efficacy or increase it. That can be a challenge, but it's always fun to kind of like consider, like, why does this system of training or program style work versus what can you kind of scrap and still have a really powerful or potent system. So
Yeah,
um
that's right.
Mike, I think I've really enjoyed kind of hearing about your experience in the kind of like performance field, and your background. For people who would love to know more or hear more, where can we kind of direct them to read what you've written, listen to talks you've given, or to kind of catch up if you have the time available?
I haven't blogged much in ages, but I have probably hundreds of blogs on Fit for Football, FUTBOL, spelled the European style, as well as Elite Track. Again, that's been ages since I blogged on there, but many of which are evergreen. I have just a ton of videos online, many of which are free, available on YouTube,
Mm.
that I just kind of like put out there. As I said, I'm passionate about coaching education and sharing what has been shared so freely with me. And then if you were looking to take a more consolidated look at my information, I think Derek has a couple of videos of mine on his website. I have probably 15 lectures or so on ltadnetwork.com,
Wow.
along with a lot of other truly brilliant people like I don't know, Boo Schexnayder and Dan Paff, and just tons of really really smart people on there. And then I am I basically have taken a year hiatus from social media, but I am about to return again. But in the past in the 2 years prior, like basically COVID years, I've put on just basically a daily training journal for my athletes, and with in-depth discussion of why we're doing what we're doing, and that's at Mike Young, PhD, on Instagram. at Mike Young PhD on Instagram, and hopefully we'll start returning to that in the next coming days. I keep telling myself that, and maybe this will be the impetus for me to do that.
Yeah, hopefully we can get you on there and putting out more of that quality content so people can kind of subscribe and be along for the ride. Uh, Mike, yeah, a huge thanks for joining me and discussing your background in the field and how you've been able to become or express how prolific you are and the impact you've been able to have, and hopefully a bunch of the aspiring strength coaches, S&C coaches, performance coaches, everyone listening, even the athletes can kind of glean a lot from this, just in terms of the approach or the mindset, and then how to kind of manifest it in success. So thanks a lot for joining me. If people want to keep up with what we're doing or what I'm doing, you can follow me on Instagram at Josh_PhilWL. That's PhilWL. You can go to my website, Philosophical Weightlifting, for resources there. And then, with Virus, Onyx straps, Earth Fed Muscle, Weightlifting House, you can use code PhilWL. That's PhilWL for 10% off pretty much every product in each store. So you can save some money, get some good products, and support me in the show as well. I hope you guys really enjoyed this episode, and we will catch you next week on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.